Welcome back to class. I hope that you had a good weekend. We're starting the final push towards the end of the semester. We only have about 3 or 4 lecture days left. Get Jose in. And then we have Thanksgiving, spend time with our families, and then the end of the semester. So I'm pretty sure the day that you come back from Thanksgiving, we have a review for the final exam, and then that Friday, the final exam is made available. So um, just keep pushing. I have already emailed you the exam 1 and exam 2. Feel free to email me back with any corrections that you might want to be working on. I graded assignment number 3, and I think that we're all caught up with the course. So without any further delay, I'm going to screen share and get into today's lecture. So we're going to start talking about the ankle and the foot and transition into a discussion about hyperpronation, and eventually we'll talk about the process of walking and how walking is such a unique, wonderful thing that occurs. Man, I wish I could just get rid of that. There we go. So, in order to talk about the ankle and about movements of the ankle, we have to know a little bit about the ankle. So, we're just going to go through a couple of motions that occur at the ankle and a couple of different parts of the ankle to be aware of. All right. So, you have your tibia. Your tibia is your big weight bearing bone of your leg, and your fibula is a smaller bone that's not so much weight bearing. It's on the medial side. It's the bone that you feel on the outer portion of your lower leg. At the bottom of your fibula and your tibia is these round malleoli. So let me explain a little bit about what a malleoli is and why they're there. First of all, there are muscles that subtend this joint and attach to the joint. Let's just, and this isn't going to be a perfect drawing, but I'll do the best I can. Here's a bone, here's another bone here, and here's a couple of other bones. This might not be the exact perfect anatomy or whatever, but these are the bones of your foot. And then you're going to have your toes here. All right. This is obviously not perfect. So the axis of rotation of this whole system would be right about here. So this is the point at which your ankle would swing and invert here and evert in this direction. And if the muscles and the tendons attached to the foot, like right here, then there would be no torque associated with them. But let's just draw in, this is your tibialis anterior muscle, the muscle that we talked about last week. All right, and that muscle is going to come right around here and attach here. So when that muscle pulls, that muscle is going to pull in, let's say, this direction here. All right, the muscle is going to be pulling on the bone in this direction. Well, if this connection was directly above this axis of rotation, again, this force due to your tibialis anterior wouldn't have any torque associated with it, because although there would be a muscle force, there wouldn't be a moment arm. But now here, let's just take this force and we'll project it all the way down. The moment arm associated with that force is now here. All right. And because there's a distance here, d, and there's a force here, then we can have a torque. And that torque associated with the tibialis anterior is equal to this force here, the force, times its moment arm, times that distance there. And now because you have a distance here, what happens is something like this. This rotation, either internal or external rotation. So these malleoli here, they also are the attachment point for, or the transition point between lots of muscular forces. So these malleoli here act as like a pulley where they create a mechanical advantage here. And because of that, it allows for the rotational movements at the foot. So it's a little bit about structure. Now, why does the foot invert when the tibialis anterior fires? Oh, because there's a torque associated with that muscular pull. So this is a physics relationship here. This is a force being pulled at a particular distance. And you could argue because of that, it's not really a cognitive process here. It could be the case that as an escapement, the brain makes this muscle, all right, contract, but all the rest of the movement that happens because of the muscle contracting happens because of physics. So instead of the brain doing this and doing this and doing everything else, what the brain does is what it needs to do when it needs to do it. It needs to potentially, and this is, overstating things, I think even, the brain needs to make this muscle contract, and then once this muscle contracts, all the rest of these degrees of freedom are already in play. So it frees up a lot of potential need for the brain to be working all the time and doing everything. So let's move on to the next slide here. And I don't want to necessarily go into all of the anatomy and physiology, but again, we noticed here that there's a heel, there's an axis point or rotation for the joint, and this heel, just like the malleoli, all right, makes it so that the Achilles tendon and the gastrocsoleus unit is acting at a particular distance away from the axis of rotation, which causes your plantar flexion, or when your dorsal flexors fire, you also notice that the dorsiflexors are attached here. Again, at a distance away from the axis of rotation. So the rotation of the foot happens because of where these muscles are attached, as opposed to my brain forcing there to be a rotation. Oh boy. So this could be a little bit of an issue because it's my birthday today and I can't stop people from calling me. So we'll have to just deal with this, I think. So we also have...
Birthday.
Thanks, Bruvy. Thanks, Jose. Thanks, my G.
No problem.
All right, my dude. So then we have these arches in your foot, and sometimes you hear people of flat-footed or fallen arches. And what these arches are is shock absorbers. So you have three different arches that we'll probably have to talk about. You have your medial longitudinal arch. Medial is towards the middle of the body. So this here is your medial longitudinal arch. It goes longitudinally all the way down the foot. Then you have your lateral longitudinal arch. It's another arch that comes like in this direction here. And then you have your transverse arch, and the transverse arch goes all the way across here. And what these arches do is act as shock absorbers. If you're supposed to take 10,000 steps a day to make sure that you're achieving the healthy amounts of physical activity, what happens if these shock absorbers don't work 10,000 times a day? Well, if you've ever been in a car that has no shocks, that's not necessarily the most fun ride. So how do issues or biomechanical breakdown of these arches and the ability to dissipate forces, how does that affect the body? So we're not going to talk about all of the particular issues associated with fallen arches, but we will talk about A couple of them. Number one is hyperpronation, and we'll talk a little bit about how that could potentially lead to knee pain, hip pain, and other issues further up the chain. What would happen here in this situation if rather than the foot, I guess, standing against the ground in this direction, what would happen if the foot was rotated more in this direction? All right. It would probably make it so that there was more force on this side, on the medial longitudinal arch. All right. And if that's the case, maybe this medial longitudinal arch starts to break down. So we'll talk a little bit more about how that could potentially happen in the next couple of slides. All right, so we got to talk a little bit about the motion of the foot. So when you create a torque, or when your muscles flex because of the torque associated with it, all right, when your anterior tib and the muscles in the front of your shin here flex, it's going to drive your foot into dorsiflexion. A dorsal fin for a shark is the fin that's on the top of its back. And that's a dorsal fin. Dorsi means back. So when your foot flexes towards your foot's back, air quotes back, it's dorsiflexion. And plantar flexion, remember you get a plantar's wart on the bottom of your foot here. So plantar flexion is pointing your toe. All right, dorsiflexion is pulling your feet this way. Now, all of these muscles here are going to fire concentrically to pull your foot into this flexion torque. But they're also going to fire eccentrically to slow that down. So when your heel hits the ground here, this moment arm associated with your heel and the axis of rotation is going to push your foot downward in this direction. And then so that your foot doesn't slap and flap into the ground here, these muscles have to fire eccentrically to do so. Now you'll notice here that as this individual is further and further into plantar flexion, Jose, can you see it would take these muscles here that are in the anterior of his shin and stretch them? Now the muscle here is contracted all the way, and now the muscle is stretched all the way. All right, remember, a muscle that's stretched further, according to your length-tension relationship, this is length here, and this is tension, at least for the active graph, looks kind of like this. So a muscle that's elongated to its greatest length, all right, can't really make an active contraction. So the tension that's provided by this muscle right here is most likely due to its passive component at this stage of the game. But there's no tendon here. There's only a connection between the muscle and the bone directly. And sometimes this connection here starts to break down because the force of the ground reaction force forces the foot into too much plantar flexion, all right, and causes these connections here to break down, or the tendons to break down in terms of like their plastic region. And that's the beginning of medial tibial stress syndrome or shin splints. So it's the ground reaction force that's going to force this foot to rotate down into this direction. And these muscles here need to be strong enough to stop that from happening. All right, so this is dorsiflexion and plantar flexion. Now, what's a natural occurring thing when your heel hits the ground is going to be this plantar flexion. The ground reaction force is going to push up here. There's a torque associated with the axis of rotation and the line of the force, and it forces the foot to come down. In order for your foot not to slap into the ground, your tibialis anterior here has to fire eccentrically to slow that down. That's something that happens naturally 10,000 times a day or more. All right, so let's clear these drawings and go to the next slide. We talked about medial tibial stress syndrome. But I want to now start changing, I guess, the angle at which we're looking at it. I don't want to look at it from a sagittal view. I want to look at it from a frontal view here. Now we have two different ways that your ankles can rotate here. All right, there's eversion, which is also known as supination, and there's inversion, which is known as, there's eversion, which is supination, and inversion, which is pronation. All right. So most of the time when people sit like on a rock wall or on a table or something and they just let their feet hang, most of the time people are inverted. So this is a little bit extreme, but that means that as an individual is walking, their foot is going to make contact with the ground slightly on the lateral side, slightly on the little toe side of the foot. So they're going to make a contact with the ground right here. And that ground reaction force is going to be within this line here. But because you have an axis of rotation, which is here, it's going to cause some type of rotation, right? So here's your moment arm associated with that ground reaction force. And this foot here is a lever. It's like a little stick. So when the ground reaction force hits here, it's going to take this part of the foot and make it want to rotate in that direction. That's for free. That happens because of ground reaction force. That happens because of gravity. That happens because of a moment arm associated with the ground reaction force. That happens because the foot has a particular width to it. That's not a cognitive action. That's just a physics thing. So the foot is going to come down into this direction here. One second. This is the hardest part about doing this. All right, we'll just go like that. So the foot is going to make contact with the ground and must rotate downwards. All right, so no idea where this mouse is. So it's going to drive the foot into what's called eversion or pronation. All right, so it's going to drive the foot into what's called pronation. So this is pronation here. You'll notice that there's a curve to the Achilles tendon. You'll notice that there's a curve to the Achilles tendon, all right? And so you have this angle here. All right, whereas normally what should happen is more here. Let's get rid of these drawings. You have this bowing here. Normally this is a little bit straighter here. Now, one thing that you might want to be considerate of the fact is that this bending shape here is not only is not necessarily just a bending force, right? Because all bending is a combination of two different forces. It's the force on this side. Hold on one second. It's the force on this side here. Let me get, and it is tricky. All right, it's the force on this side of the joint, and it's also the force on the opposite side of the joint. But those are two different forces. All right, so there's a force on this side. One second. That's better. There's a load on this side of the Achilles tendon that's different than the load on this side of the Achilles tendon. Let me explain, all right? Let's say, for instance, I have, and I don't know if this is going to carry over well, but let's say I have a pen, all right? I always use this as the example in class. I have a pen and a pen here. I don't think that this is going to work, but I'll try. I just have a pen. It's this long, and on, it's supposed to look like a pen, so I'll make that a little bit better. Or I have a stick. It doesn't have to be a pen. It's not, but I always use a pen because it's available. All right, so on the top part of the pen here, I have letters that are written. It says BIC. All right, so I'm just going to draw these. This isn't exactly how it looks, but it says a BIC pen. BIC pen. And you have one of those like little plastic pens in school that you use all the time. That's why I use this as a good demonstration. Now let's say I take the pen and I bend it in this direction. So I grab it from either end and I bend the pen in that direction. And now the pen is going to have a little bit of a bent orientation to it. The pen's going to now look like this. Like I bend the pen. So now the pen looks like this. Jose, when I bend the pen and I make it look like this, okay, what is going to happen to the lettering that's on the top of the pen right here?
It's gonna like bend with it. Like it's not gonna be straight anymore. It's gonna be like on the shape of like a little rainbow type.
Okay, and would you say if I bend it so that the words are actually written here, one second, let me just try to make this clear. If the words are actually written on the top edge of this pen and I bend it this way, the lettering of the words, Jose, the lettering of the words themselves when I bend the pen down, are the letters going to stretch outwards or are they going to compress towards each other?
They're gonna stretch outwards, so they're gonna like stretch out.
Right. So I think that what Jose is saying is on this side of the surface, sorry, on this side of the surface of the pen, there's going to be a stretch. This part of the surface is going to stretch, all right, such that the words, the letters actually also stretch in this direction. But what happens on the bottom surface of the pen is not stretching. All right. What
It's
happens on this surface of the pen is different than stretching. Jose, what would you say happens on this part of the surface of that pen?
like you said earlier. So obviously the top part is gonna stretch out, and then the part at the bottom is gonna compress.
So right
Like
here, I just want to note out, and Jose, all your answers are exactly right. What I want you to recognize here is that bending is not just one load in itself. Bending is a combination of different loading on either side of the material. On this side of the material, there's going to be a stretching. But on this side of the material, there's going to be a compression. That's going to change the amount of force that the Achilles tendon has to deal with on either side of this shape here. So this increased pronation here, this too much pronation, this hyperpronation, too much, hyper. Hyper is too much of something, hyperactive, all right? Too much pronation is going to cause a potential change in the alignment of this Achilles tendon. And if that's the case, a change in potentially how that Achilles tendon can absorb and generate force. Now, a lot of times in gymnastics, you'll see hyperpronation. I don't have the statistic. All right, but hyperpronation happens for a number of different reasons. First, it can happen because of ankle weakness, but it can also happen because of the environment, because of the matting that we work on. And when gymnasts work out, they run on foam, usually barefoot. And when you hit, I'm going to erase all this stuff. Good job, Jose. So when you run on a foam surface, what happens is because there's foam underneath your foot can actually sink in the foam into a deeper dorsiflexion. So normally the ground reaction force right here, normally the ground would be under the foot here, and as you make contact with this part of your foot into the ground, that plantar flexion would stop. But because we're on squishy surfaces, when the individual hits the ground, what's going to happen is the foot's going to either push the mat down, right? And that's going to allow the foot to get into deeper plantar flexion. It's also going to work from the same principle from the opposite perspective here, right? It's going to allow that foot to roll deeper into hyperpronation because there's a squishy surface. Now what that's going to do is that's going to allow for a deeper plantar flexion and deeper pronation. And what that's going to do is it's going to potentially take these muscles here and pull them further and further into this situation where you can't produce active tension because the muscle's getting longer and longer. And then the active eccentric muscle contraction that's slowing all this stuff down isn't strong enough because there's not enough actinomycin, because there's hyperplantar flexion and hyperpronation, that what happens is these arches have to start to take more and more force, and these ligaments have to take more and more force, until what happens is you have a little bit of a hyperpronation problem. It's going to take all of the ligaments here and put them on stretch, which is going to push those ligaments further into their plastic region, making them potentially weaker, making them potentially longer, allowing for even more mobility, and then you have a chain of events that's potentially led to increased pain. Another thing that we should consider is a little bit of functional anatomy, and I haven't done too much functional anatomy in this course, but we have to start thinking of the body as like this chain of events that, like, one thing leads to the next, that leads to the next. For instance, if you sit with your knee bent and you extend your leg, you can even try it here. A knee extension, straightening your leg, also forces external tibial rotation. So you can even watch your foot do it. As you straighten your leg, your tibia, your shin, externally rotates. And when you flex your leg, the opposite happens. You can even kind of like just move your ankle around and move your ankle into pronation, and you'll see that your tibia internally rotates. So as you're walking, what happens is you're extending your leg, all right, because you're about to hit the ground. Your leg is coming through. Here, I'll even try to do like this. You're walking here. Your knee is bent. Your foot's off the ground. Here's your knee. Here's your hip. And your leg is swinging in this direction. And your leg is bent. This foot is swinging forward. Now, what that's going to cause is that's going to cause your leg to eventually get to a straighter position here. Your leg is going to swing to here. You have your ankle. And as your foot swings forward here, your leg is extending. And that means that as your leg is extending, your tibia is externally rotating. And that external rotation is going to make it so that your lateral aspect of your foot is closer to the ground and ready to strike the lateral aspect of your foot onto the ground. And then that's going to help create the torque that allows your foot to internally rotate and to hyperpronate, all right, and absorb the forces. But as your leg is extending here, let me get back to my mouse. So as your leg is extending, your leg is externally rotating. Then you're going to hit the ground. Boom, your heel hits the ground. And the ground is going to cause your knee to flex. Your knee is going to buckle here. As your knee starts to bend, your external rotation is going to stop, and then that's going to start to lead to internal tibial rotation. And that internal tibial rotation is going to allow for pronation to occur, or internal tibial rotation leads to pronation. Then as I leave the ground, let me try to draw this too. As I leave the ground, my foot is, sorry. As you leave the ground, you have your toe is kind of buckled underneath. Your toe is like this. Your heel's off the ground. Your leg is here. You're about to push off. Your leg is actually going this way. And your leg is starting to extend, pushing the ground backwards. Your leg is extending. That leg extension, all right, is going to cause another external tibial rotation. So at toe off, you're externally rotating. So there's like this functional constraints that are occurring here. And they occur because of ligamentous connections and the way that your skeletal structure is organized and stuff. Well, what happens if I have too much of something within this particular system or this emergent system here? Well, if the timing of my pronation is disrupted, then the rest of these natural occurrences are also potentially bound to be interrupted. So if the matting or if my shoes or if the way that I'm running or my arches, if those things are not functioning correctly, then my ability to pronate is impacted, and then all of this other stuff that's connected to pronation because of one thing or another is also bound to have a particular issue. So let me try to. All right. Mouse. All right, so let's just take a look about what should occur in the body as you're walking. All right, so let's just take a look here. This is your foot. This is your foot graph. This is your stance phase, and this is your swing phase. So right here, this is when your heel hits the ground. And up is supination and down is pronation. So you'll see the graph goes down, 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 down. So when your heel hits the ground, you swing your leg forward, your heel hits the ground is going to force your body into pronation. All right, it's going to force your foot into pronation. Your foot is going to invert. It's going to roll, it's going to evert. It's going to roll from your pinky toe all the way to your big toe. Pinky toe to big toe. Then once you get back to the middle of your stance, all right, your hip is right over your foot, and you're starting to like lean over your axis of rotation, your ankle joint, all right, and you're going to start to push down with your toe. All right, that's the beginning of your stance phase right here. And you notice that as your body comes up and over your axis of rotation, then your body starts to change and push into supination all the way up here, all the way up to here. Your body, your foot is supinating. Now, right about here is when your toe is getting ready to push off the ground, and your foot is swinging all the way forward, So as your body hits the ground, it pronates, As you start to push off of the ground, you push all the way into supination so that your little toe is coming off the ground now. And as you swing your foot forward, 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 it swings all the way and starts to hit the ground. And as it hits the ground, it's already starting to roll back into your pronation. So that's what should happen. You'll notice that as your foot is pronating, this is inward rotation. Everything, your pelvis, your femur, your tibia, everything rotates inwards. You can tell because inwards is going upwards. So right now it's going up, 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 stops going up. And then at about mid stance phase, your pelvis is going to start to rotate, into outward rotation. And now your pelvis at swing phase stops and starts to rotate inward. Same thing here with your femur. So you'll notice that the tibia and the femur do almost the same thing. And then when my tibia moves inward, my femur moves, when my tibia moves inward, my femur moves inward, and so does my pelvis. So what happens at the foot drives all the way up the body. So somebody who has this pronation that happens too long, they're still pronating. How is that going to affect this whole symphony here? In fact, it does. So you'll notice here, though, that pronation stops right about here, and so does the inward rotation of all of these bones here. Then you start to go into supination, and as supination occurs, there's this coupling of each one of these into more of an outward rotation. And again, when the foot pushes back into pronation, these things change their direction. So at heel strike, your foot is typically pronating. When you get to your foot flat stance, it stops and kind of like your foot is now on the ground flat. Now you're starting to lean a little bit more forward. Your heel is lifting off the ground. Here's where your toe is lifting off the ground. And you can see that naturally things are going to go from a pronation, and eventually they're going to slide back into supination. What happens if I pronate all the way to here? What happens then? Well, pronation, we talked about pronation is leading to internal rotation. But when I leave the ground, my leg is extending, and I'm supposed to externally rotate. So if I pronate too late, it's going to want my foot and my tibia to be rotating inwards, but the knee extension at toe off wants my tibia to externally rotate. So I have an internal rotation and I have an external rotation. It's going to look something like this. So here's my tibia, So I have an external rotation, or let's say I have a rotation in this direction because of the hyperpronation, but I have a rotation in this direction because of my leg extension. Now, obviously, if I have a bone that's being torqued in one direction versus another direction, that's going to be a loading that is going to lead to potential injury. So this hyperpronation thing here is not only a muscular thing that's changing the way that the tibialis anterior is functioning, but it's also going to lead to changes all the way down the line. So when we talk about hyperpronation, we're not necessarily talking about too much. All right? Hyper doesn't always just mean too much. So when I hyperpronate, it means that yes, I do go into pronation for too much of an angle. So it could be too much of an angle, where instead of, say, for instance, pronating, I don't know, 45 degrees, I pronate 75 degrees. So number one, you could be pronating too much of an angle. And if that's the case, it's more of a magnitude thing. But you could hyperpronate for too long. You could pronate for too much time. All right. So when we're talking about hyperpronation, we don't want to just consider the angle or the magnitude of the pronation. We want to consider the time. So here, if we were talking about the angle, it could be the fact that there's too much pronation, so the graph would come down this way, but it would still be coupled to the right time of the heel lift and the walking phase. But you could have hyperpronation such that the graph doesn't have more of an amplitude here. It doesn't go down as much, so you could have hyperpronation that looks something like this, where it's lower graph than normal, but it gets back into the groove. But you could also have hyperpronation that looks something like this, where it's still the same amplitude. It just goes for a longer period of time before it gets back into its natural position. So this number one here is more of an angle or a greater magnitude of pronation. But number two is that the timing of your pronation is off. And that's kind of what that article that we talked about. It's not just subscapular strength. It's the timing or the delay or the latency of that subscap strength that was leading to the pain in those individuals who threw in our last homework assignment. So let's take a look and see what else we got. Getting close to the end today. So let's go to the next slide. So we'll probably stop here so that we have a good slide to start on Wednesday. But what should happen is at heel strike, you have the ground reaction force that's pushing upwards. Sorry. At heel strike, you have this ground reaction force that's going to push up. And because you have an axis of rotation here and a distance away, it's going to cause this whole thing to fall in that direction. It's not a brain-driven thing. That's torque. That's ground reaction force. That's Newton's laws. That's this moment arm associated with the structure of the ankle. So if somebody said, how does this happen? Is this a brain-driven thing that forces your foot to go into hyperpronation? I would say no. What it is it's a physics-driven thing. All right. So then what happens is as that ground reaction force causes this rotation into pronation, what should happen is this foot is going to start to transition. And the transition, you'll notice, is lateral side on the ground here. The foot rotates in mid-stance. It should be here. And then there's going to be some semblance of internal or some sense of pronation as the foot starts to leave the ground. Then as the foot starts to leave the ground and it's already in pronation, it's going to start to go toe off. And then at toe off, it should switch back to this lateral aspect of the foot interacting with the ground. All right, so you strike on the lateral aspect. That ground reaction force causes the pronation through mid-stance. And then as my leg extends, it straightens and I start to push off the ground, my foot should roll back into more of a supination. All right, and then this is a graph that you'll see in the homework assignment that you have, the final homework assignment. This is from Gail Monahan's paper, and we'll start probably with this slide on Wednesday. But what it's showing is it's showing different amounts of hyperpronation, and this is a forefoot. A forefoot is the front of your foot. So she has two groups of people. Some individuals whose front of their foot lies more in inversion, and other individuals whose front of the foot lies relatively normal compared to this group. And I'll explain what that means. But you'll notice that for this group, this large forefoot varus group, you'll notice that here's the pronation line for the moderate forefoot variation group. Here's the average here. And you'll notice that this dark line right here, this band here, it goes together with this band here. And you'll notice that down here, this dark line here is much later than this line here. All right, so you'll see this is eversion. It means that this group here seems to be everting a little bit more than this group here. And not only that, but the minimum position here, all right, for this moderate group seems to start tracking upwards. You'll notice there's a little sliver here, all right, where this large group is still a little bit too far pushed this way. So they're supinating, they're getting back into supination later in the cycle, and they're also everting a little bit more than their moderate 4-foot varus counterparts. All right, so foot structure, and not only foot structure, but we could also say something like the structure of the shoes that you wear, or the surfaces that you're bouncing on, all right, may have a lot to do with how your feet are interacting. You have a surface like this, it's going to force a huge amount of pronation, and that could potentially have some impact all the way up the chain. All right, so we just want to be mindful of the kinds of shoes, all right, and the impact that broken down shoes or surfaces can have on this whole process. All right, so I think what I can do is stop the share right there. Ask anybody who has any questions to come on mic. Anybody have any comments or anything like that?
You get my email?
Let me double check it. We'll take care of it afterwards.
All right, sounds good.
Okay, everybody? Yeah? All right, I hope you guys have a great day. Take care.
All right, have a good one.
All right, you too.